Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that normally takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Today we are extremely privileged to have with us Subir Gokarn, former Deputy Governor, Reserve Bank of India and presently Executive Director on the board of the IMF representing India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Bhutan. Welcome to the show, Subir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's been over a year now, Subir, that you moved to Washington and the IMF. Tell me, does the world look very different now after a year? And is the view from Washington very different from what it is in New Delhi?
I think in many ways it is. For the first time, I'm actually getting a very sort of systematic exposure to our neighbors,
because
which I represent.
Okay.
And so I've begun to understand the drivers and the risks in these countries in a way which I don't think I ever had the opportunity to do here, or even the need, I think, which is sort of reflecting the relative visibilities of these countries. But now I'm beginning to see certain common elements, certain common drivers, and also the way in which these countries are dealing with a bunch of global factors as well as their own domestic constraints. But on a wider scale, I think the sense that one gets from being exposed to 189 countries. The IMF has 189 members, and all of them are dealing in somewhat similar ways with what has essentially been a very, very prolonged phase of sluggish growth, some recovery, but all the problems that are associated with persistently slow growth. And different countries are dealing with it with different levels of effectiveness. But I think there are common problems across countries, and I think it's very important then for us to be able to, not see ourselves in any kind of a sui generis fashion.
So it helps to be one of a crowd.
Absolutely.
And do we look better or worse than the crowd?
I find that we are doing, far better than, when I say we, I mean India. Doing far better than many other countries are doing. So it's both a bit worrying and a bit reassuring at the same time.
So have we been doing consistently better, or have we kind of improved recently, you would say?
Well, I think if you look at the last 3 or 4 years, we are and have been amongst the highest growing. Certainly in the G20, we have the fastest rate of growth. As far as the IMF forecasts are concerned, we did do a little worse because of the demonetization effect. But that's a transitory effect, and they also say that we will start to get back to a more normal trajectory very soon. 5 BRICS countries, 3 are commodity exporters.
Sure.
And South Africa, Brazil and Russia have been in recessionary conditions for the last 2 years, are now starting to slowly come out of recession,
with the commodity,
but are still going to be growing at very, very low rates. China is slowing down on a sort of secular basis between 6 and 7% over the next couple of years, for which the outlooks are presented. So it's not doing badly, but clearly it's moving out of that stratospheric category that it used to be earlier.
So I think a lot of the pat that we kind of keep giving ourselves on the back is a little unwarranted. 6.7, 7, etc. looks very good, but if you compare with where we are and all the other BRICS, we are way behind them, aren't we?
In terms of?
In terms of absolute levels of income,
yes,
of poverty, almost any parameter, right?
We are the lowest. We have the lowest per capita GDP of the G20. And that
human development indicators, everything, I think there's virtually no parameter.
Compares. But I think ultimately the focus, the IMF focus is macro, so it's growth, fiscal, monetary and external sector. And on those parameters we are relatively stable. Now if we get into human development, that's long-term structural issues, and of course the fund is focused on those issues as well. But then that gets into more of the World Bank's or development finance regime, and with a different set of considerations.
You talked about global economy, and I was looking at the IMF January WEO, World Economic Outlook, and it said, it took a fairly sober view, and I quote, it says the risks to the global growth outlook are two-sided, but are assessed to be skewed on the downside, especially over the medium term because of political risk, protectionism, leveraged corporate balance sheets, etc. And it also said the potential for disappointment is large. Has that views changed subsequently now that Trump has taken over, and many of the fears have been found, if not entirely unfounded? Well, perhaps not as bad. The US economy does seem to be recovering, Europe is recovering, Japan is recovering. So has the IMF's view of the disappointments, likely potential for disappointments, is going to be large. Has that view somewhat been tempered?
Well,
and will we see a change in the April update?
I think we wouldn't know till we actually have the April document. In fact, the board will be discussing the April outlook in the first week of April. It will be then published on the eve of the spring meetings, which the week begins on the 17th of April.
Right.
So January is really the latest formal statement of the fund's views. Now keep in mind that by January we already had the US election outcome. We'd already
but he hadn't taken over
Brexit.
in that sense. He wasn't firmly in the saddle.
I think it's the policy implications of what or the policy trajectory of the administration is still sort of
very uncertain,
shaping up. We've obviously seen setbacks on some of the key elements, the immigration and healthcare. So we don't quite know how it's moving. Also, the next few months will see European elections, and we've already, the sort of globalists, if you will, have received some reassurance from the Dutch outcome. We're waiting to see what happens in France and then in Germany. Does this represent a broader, anti-globalization, anti-integration kind of movement, or is that going to be contained? I think is the big question, which is why the focus is so much on the political uncertainty. But there are also some structural factors which are reinforcing this sort of, skew towards the downside. And I think the three most important ones, which the fund has been consistently talking about, and so has the bank, the World Bank. Trade slowdown is very important compared to the pre-financial crisis
and you
period.
don't see that pick up with global growth?
No, I think when you look ahead, trade is not expected to be picking up very significantly. So as an engine of growth, it has now lost its place. Global trade is growing just about as fast as global GDP. It was growing at twice the pace of global GDP in the 20 years preceding the crisis. Investment has slowed down considerably. Again, investment was an engine of growth in the pre-financial crisis decade. It is now slowed down dramatically. I think global investment is growing at something like 3.5%.
But isn't that just a case of excess capacity now, and hopefully once demand picks up?
There are a number of factors at work, and excess capacity is one of them. But there are also other factors. There is the whole emergence of the share economy, what I call unearthing capacity, which is obvious ones being Uber and Airbnb.
But that might be good for a country like India, which is capital scarce. Would you not agree?
I think we have to start reconsidering the notion. So investment as an expenditure is a driver. It's keeping a lot of industries afloat. It gives creates demand for a whole bunch of things. Third one I want to emphasize, technology. Again, we have automation being a driving force. We had the World Bank president, Dr. Kim, 4 months in October, talking about the threat. Yes, 69% of Indian jobs, 77% of Chinese jobs. This is a massive shock. Now, one can sort of look into these estimates and see how they are arrived at. But if you're looking at this kind of magnitude, if automation is rendering a huge number of people redundant, it has massive implications for short to medium term growth. What are these people going to
not just growth, Subir, in a country like ours where we've seen virtually jobless growth, if even those who have jobs now are going to lose their jobs, I think the socio-political implications of them could be fairly catastrophic.
And it's true for our country, certainly it's true for the neighborhood, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and it's true for much of Southeast Asia, which is still being driven, Vietnam and so on, still being driven by labor-intensive manufacturing. Africa is vulnerable. Nigeria has a very large population.
But my question right now is more about the immediate, Subir, because the IMF, in fact, had lowered India's GDP growth following the demonetization to 6.6%. That was a full percentage point lower. But when we saw the CSO numbers, it's almost as if the demonetization really had no impact at all. So could it be that the IMF has erred? Of course, like everybody else, the IMF has erred in the past. But could it really be that the demonetization really has not impacted the economy? Or is it that this kind of thing shows up after a very long lagged effect? And it's very difficult for us to really assess the direct correlation and causation.
I think that's because the fund uses some, I would say, and since I was deeply involved in the process as an observer and as a sort of commentator, wanting to make sure that whatever they did was legitimate. I think they use certain methodologies which are reasonable. They use certain assumptions about correlations and elasticities and so on, which is there where the judgment comes. And different forecasters use different assumptions. 6.6 was a little bit on the low side, but most certainly private sector forecasts were in this around 6.7. So it wasn't that much of an outlier. But now we see the reality. We see the estimates. And of course, people are questioning the estimates, but I think we have to wait and watch and be a little careful about, just rejecting these estimates out of hand. I think there are two factors here. One is that when you look at certain sectors like construction, for example, clearly it has the estimate is lower than the projections. So it does suggest that to some extent demonetization has played out in that sector, which many people are expecting. So the composition of growth has changed, even though the actual has remained constant. The concern that people have had is consumption expenditure, which was supposed to be badly hit by demonetization, has actually shown an acceleration. And so that is, I think, the basis for some skepticism. But it's a little too early to make that judgment. I think the estimates of informal sector activity, which have been the most directly affected by demonetization, are really based on very, very, I'd say, somewhat removed parameters. And it's only when sort of harder data comes in that you start to revise and arrive at a somewhat more precise estimate. So we'll have to wait and see where the revision takes us. But for the moment, I think it's reasonable to conclude that there was a shock. It impacted some sectors. Whether it has actually impacted the aggregate or not is a matter of debate, particularly around the estimates.
The fund's skepticism about the new GDP estimates, has that been largely resolved, or was the fund never as skeptic as a lot of other multilateral brokerages, etc.?
I think the fund is, by the nature of the organization, required to accept official numbers.
Apart from which, I think these were as per best practices laid down by international bodies.
I think people tend to believe with no basis that there is a lot of arbitrariness in GDP numbers, and there isn't. Just as you have corporate accounting protocols, best practices, generally accepted practices, there is a system of national accounts which gives countries a very, very detailed template and some flexibility where you can't find exactly the data that you need. But India is following that. It's not as though there is some deviation from that.
So possibly, I think earlier estimates were perhaps underestimates for the earlier years, and once we get the back series, some of the skepticism
that may be a little difficult also, because we've seen the structure of the economy evolving so rapidly that finding back series for a lot of activities.
Which is why
I was in the past involved in technical committees which tried to do this, and I represented the industry chambers since I was associated with one of them at that time. And the feeling from a lot of people from the chambers was, if you go back 3 or 4 years, there are a lot of activities which are significant now that you didn't have then. And let me just give you a simple example of e-commerce. 5 years ago, did we even know what it was? And now it's dominating the landscape.
That is true.
So how do we get estimates for this activity, which is a completely new business model? We have to simulate it, we have to make it up. And so then, in that sense, your guess is as good as mine when it comes to back series.
Another issue which is top of the mind for almost everybody in India, particularly in the financial sector, is what to do with the NPAs. Does the fund really have a view, or are NPAs, I think something which most people don't get, is that NPAs are almost endemic to modern banking and capitalist systems. So is there a certain inevitability about it which we must accept, and ultimately, whether it is the US or the Scandinavian countries or China or any other country, ultimately NPAs, there is a fiscal cost, and one can at best try to minimize the fiscal cost. So is it time we accepted that, or should we kind of say, a lot of people have been arguing, no, that if you do that, then you're allowing the borrowers to get away scot-free. So you need to have some kind of a mix. It can't be just the fist taking the entire burden. Borrowers must also be forced to cough up, because your bankruptcy laws is going to be a while before they really get get any traction. So it has to be a combination of some kind of forbearance from RBI. So where did we err, or was there no error at all? Is that the price we paid for the boom that we saw in the 2008-9 when you asked banks to lend? It's a very complex situation.
There are commonalities across countries in terms of where NPAs come from. And those commonalities essentially relate to business cycle dynamics and the fact that borrowers tend to go into default when demand slumps, their revenues don't cover their interest obligations or their repayment obligations. But India has a couple of, I think, unique problems. One is the fact that banks lend to infrastructure,
Right.
which is not common practice. I mean, other countries have specialized institutions or markets or whatever. But
We
commercial
also had,
banks,
but then you finally disbanded
yes, commercial
them.
banks lending
Yes.
to on long term. And when they did that in the late 2000s, the belief was that as these projects start to come on stream, the banks can exit at
Right.
attractive prices. But because of the problems we had with the sector, that opportunity never arose.
Right.
So they then became NPAs on bank balance sheets.
But
So,
how much of this was because they were kind of almost commanded to do it by the government?
well, that
part
I
of
think
public
that's
ownership?
less of a problem or less of an issue
Okay.
than the fact that bank balance sheets cannot handle long-term finance. So the expectation that this would be a startup issue and they would exit mezzanine or however debt, you know, sort of selling off to other investors. That opportunity never arose because many of these projects just stalled.
Yeah.
So we can't deal with infra NPAs in the same way that we're dealing with other NPAs. That's so we have to make a clear distinction. Then there are issues about obligations from public utilities. I mean, we know, for example, the state electricity boards have had a problem. So that is again not a common feature. That's almost uniquely Indian. Then you take away the rest of it, which is the business models going sour. I think that's where we have basically commonalities with everybody else who's trying to do it. And there's a variety of ways in which this is being done. There are bad bank models, you know, asset reconstruction models. But I think the key issue that we have to address and have not done so, I think we may be in a sense, you know, being a little hesitant to address this straight up, is valuation. And that comes down to who is going to bear the burden.
Absolutely.
So I think the argument, and if you're looking at best practices, I think the principle that has to apply is that you know, all the stakeholders need to be sharing it.
Yes.
How do you then distribute the cost is the issue. We've made significant progress through the bankruptcy and insolvency process, which allows going concerns to declare bankruptcy. And so, you know, as long as the business is afloat, things have to be resolved so that you don't run it into the, bring it to stop and then try and allocate. Which is the problem, the BIFR model. Essentially, you know, the business shut down before you started to to try and revive it, which didn't really work. So traditional bankruptcies, or sets of you know, business models going bad either because cyclical conditions or you just chose the wrong business model. Those I think have to be addressed through this asset reconstruction process, where valuation becomes key. I think what I'm seeing as I look across countries is the ones who have got the valuation process relatively right. How do you put a value on the assets that you're going to sell? Do you blame bank managers for having undersold, for example, which is a risk that we have here? That needs to be addressed. If you do that, then I think you could be thinking of asset reconstruction framework, a bad bank kind of model, or banks themselves dealing with this. But they have to then be indemnified against the valuation issue. So I think we've got to confront this issue of valuation head on. I think that's where our process needs to
But apart from it, Subir, the problem really is that whatever you do to resolve the issue today, unless you do something about the process of lending in India today, you are going to have a repeat of the same situation tomorrow, because you'll address a bad bank NPAs today, and 5 years down the line you'll have exactly the same situation.
Not necessarily. I think we have to take the infra part away. That's not going to be repeated. Now keep in mind that infra.
But who's going to lend to infrastructure then?
We needed to create the markets. We have in the last 8 or 10 years seen a significant expansion in pension funds and insurance funds. We do have the ability to get
remotely adequate for the kind of demand that we have for infrastructure financing.
But that's the point. But that's the first step. We do have the NIF, the National Infrastructure and Investment Fund, which was set up 2 years ago.
Non-starter.
That's the point. Now, why is it non-starter? I think we have to, I think as a model, it was a perfectly legitimate model. Why has it taken so long to get off the ground? I think is a question we have to ask. But that is a leverage model where you essentially use some government money as seed capital. There was a 20,000 crore allocation to it in the 2015 budget, and use that as a basis to raise money. And infrastructure projects, because of their cash flow patterns, are very easy to leverage. Utilities in the US, for example, are significantly more leveraged than the average business. because their cash flows are very predictable. So you can take more debt
Except that in
to service.
India, Subir, even the cash flows are not predictable because these are all political economy questions. Government will
But
say, don't charge for power, don't charge at all.
So all of these things need to come
Yeah.
together. But just look at how the system responds. Keep in mind that between, I'd say, 2010 and 2013, about 20 states, if I recall, it was certainly in the high teens, actually raised their power tariffs. Average increase was about 20-25%. Some states went even higher. Why did they do that? Because basically they hit upon a hard budget constraint.
Yes.
Now, the minute they realize that it's a choice between raising the tariffs and having no power at all, I think the right choice is made. They raise the tariffs.
You're not enthused by public-private partnerships. You don't think that works in India?
I think again, did we have the model right? Is the question. Globally, this has not been by any means a uniform success. But we do have learnings about what might make them successful. I think one thing that we have to focus on is at what stage, at who bears the risk at what stage. I think the one thing we have to learn from our own experience, I think this sort of gels with whatever sort of global, not for PPP per se, but infrastructure financing in general, is that we got in the PPP framework the private sector to bear the risk at the initial stage of the project. I think that is something which we did with a sort of outlier. Rarely has that happened in infrastructure, occasional projects, yes. So the government bearing the risk in the early stages, I think, was an essential step. I think the NIF provides a framework to do that.
So we need to build on it, perhaps.
We need to run quickly. But so risk bearing, PPP, I've been calling it, we have to move from PPP, which implies sort of synchronicity or simultaneity, to FPTP, which is first public, then private. That the early
first
stage
the public bears the risk, and then when everything is doing,
I don't think we have any choice. This is what the banks were expecting in the late 2000s. They thought, let's get these projects started. Great investment because these are foolproof. As they reach the revenue generating stage, maybe 2 years, 3 years prior to revenues, a lot of other investors be interested. We can, offload the stakes and be at a price that is very attractive. That didn't happen.
Now, if I can shift to GST, how enthused is the fund and you specifically about GST? Will it be disruptive? And how disruptive short term? This is one of those things that will yield dividends, but much further down the line. And short term, will the economy again pay a price for it?
I am actually very enthused by GST. I have been looking at the experience that states had with the implementation of VAT from 2005 to 2008. The central government had offered all kinds of reassurances in terms of compensating for losses and so on. In the 3 years that we saw before, only 2 states claimed it, and that also only in one of the 3 years. Most of these states saw massive revenue buoyancy, and we actually have, I think, leading up to the year before the financial crisis, when we had a sort of slowdown and so on, states aggregatively had moved to a primary surplus situation. They were the first time we were seeing the revenue buoyancy being so much, it completely offset, the interest payments and so on. So that, to me, suggests that self-regulating taxes in this country are a good thing. Moving to the central and reconciliation, I think we should certainly depend on the technology, the sort of whole IT infrastructure that we have. There could be risks. It's going to be a learning process, but I don't see that disruption as being an argument against.
No, I mean there is no argument.
And I think
you have no choice but to go ahead.
I think the disruption will be relatively short-lived. So I can't see. I think this is a huge fiscal movement. The fund. Overall, the fund's view, the India team's view, is also very positive on this. This is based on a whole bunch of comparisons that are done. Wherever GST has been introduced, it has contributed to revenue buoyancy, greater equality, because you're basically seeing more people who didn't pay taxes paying
coming to the audit trail.
And also, I think, and I've been emphasizing this point, that tax collection as a process becomes more and more efficient as you centralize it. And so that's the direction which we're moving with direct taxes, with GST. It's all becoming a sort of integrated, centralized system.
And technology driven, so that is a huge positive.
But spending, is more efficient when it's decentralized. So on the Finance Commission, for example, the greater discretionary spending that states, the power that states been given, I think is a much better way to deal with localized and differentiated needs.
The major positives and the major challenges, what would they be?
I think the positives are that our macro situation when it comes to inflation, current account deficit, the fiscal situation, are all in a zone which is consistent with the ability to both certainly to accelerate growth, but at least to sustain it. If you look at our macro conditions in the year before our high growth phase, there's a great similarity here. So I think the macro requirements for fast growth, I think, are very much in place. So that's a very positive.
So the take-off stage, we're at the take-off stage, as it were.
Well, but consistent, because these things can change. So oil prices were to shoot up, you would have that risk. I think commodity price outlook, by and large, is very favorable for commodity importers. Even though we're seeing some ups and downs in oil price and so on, the ability to sort of push them, out of the or into a danger zone, I think, is quite limited. So we don't have too much to worry about from that front. We need to get our infrastructure act in order. I think that's been the stumbling block, the threat all along. We need to certainly be looking, and you raised this issue about joblessness and so on. We're facing a number of structural challenges to creating jobs, even if we had the momentum, automation and other factors are going against it. How do we put so many people to work? What are the sort of training, skilling? Do we need to be forward-looking about employment? I think we need to be training people for jobs that are going to arise, not for jobs that are rapidly become obsolete. I think we've got to be thinking about that in terms of job creation. But that's going to be a very significant challenge. So
great speaking with you,
nice
Subir. And good thing is, I think you're broadly positive, and that's very good to hear, certainly. So if the view both from Delhi as well as Washington is positive, then it has to be but positive.
Well, let's hope so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.